In the vast and bustling expanse of the Galactic Nexus, a massive interstellar marketplace brimming with countless species and cultures, there were places untouched by light or compassion. Deep within one such shadowed passage, a small alien dragon named Emberling endured a life of quiet suffering. Once a radiant, shimmering creature whose scales shimmered like molten stars, Emberling had become a pale, withered version of himself, worn down by years of neglect and cruelty. Barely larger than a domestic cat, with wings that seemed too fragile to carry him, Emberling's eyes once glowed with the curiosity of a young explorer, but now they were clouded with sadness and despair. The larger dragons mocked him for his size, while other alien beings taunted his inability to fly. Even the maintenance crew of the Nexus paid him no mind, shoving him aside like worthless debris. Emberling's world had shrunk to the narrow alleyways and the scraps he could scrounge together. Most days he curled up in an old, discarded crate, trying to remember what it felt like to belong, to feel strong, to dream. The sounds of laughter from the lively crowds above only deepened his sense of isolation. Yet even in the darkest corners of his existence, there was a flicker of hope, a small ember within him that refused to die. Meanwhile, a 12-year-old girl named Elara Lysander had just arrived at the Galactic Nexus with her father, Ambassador Lysander, who had come to broker a crucial trade deal between warring factions. While her father was caught up in diplomatic talks, Elara's curiosity about the Nexus grew by the minute. She had never seen such a vibrant mix of life before, giant creatures lumbering through the halls, floating jellyfish-like beings drifting through the air. As awe-inspiring as it all was, it also felt overwhelming. Her father had warned her to stay close, but Elara's adventurous spirit was too strong. As she wandered deeper into the labyrinth of alleys below, a faint sound caught her attention, a soft, pitiful whimper. Tilting her head, Elara felt her heart tug with sympathy. She followed the sound, stepping carefully over discarded machinery and heaps of debris. There, inside a battered cargo crate, she found Emberling. His once glorious scales were dull, and his wings were folded awkwardly against his body. When he saw her, he let out a feeble hiss, his amber eyes full of a mixture of fear and defiance. Elara knelt down, keeping a respectful distance. "Hey there," she said gently, her voice warm like the soft glow of a distant sun. "I'm not going to hurt you." Emberling lowered his head slightly, eyeing her with caution. She reached into her small bag and pulled out a piece of dried fruit. "Are you hungry?" "It's not much, but it's yours if you want it." The little dragon sniffed the air, his instincts warring with his distrust. Slowly he crept forward and snatched the food, devouring it quickly. For the first time in days, Emberling felt something other than hunger or pain. Elara smiled softly, her heart swelling. "See? We can be friends." This time, Emberling didn't growl. Instead, he tilted his head, watching the curious human who had shown him a kindness long forgotten. Though he didn't understand her words, something about her tone calmed him, and for the first time in ages, the ember inside him seemed to glow just a little brighter. The next morning, Elara returned to Emberling. She slipped away from her father's security detail with the quiet ease of a child who had long learned to bend the rules. This time, her bag wasn't just filled with dried fruit. She had a variety of snacks, things she'd swiped from the kitchens of the Nexus. She approached the small dragon again, offering him more food, and this time she stayed even longer, talking to him softly, telling him stories of the world above. Little by little, the cold, lonely ember inside Emberling began to grow, fed by her kindness, her patience, and the small bond that was slowly forming between them. For the first time in a long while he began to feel something new: hope. Chapter 2. A Heart Unfrozen. The days passed, and each morning Elara returned, sneaking away from her father's watchful eyes to visit the little dragon she had come to care for. As the days turned into weeks, the bond between them grew stronger. Emberling, though still cautious, began to trust her more. His dull scales began to glisten faintly, as if the kindness she offered him was slowly reigniting the light that had been lost for so long. Elara's heart swelled with each visit, as she saw the small dragon becoming more responsive. His eyes, once filled with sorrow, were now curious, and he would follow her with his gaze as she moved around him. She started bringing more than just food, little toys she'd found in the marketplace, colorful stones and pieces of cloth to create a soft bedding in the crate where Emberling spent his days. She would sit with him, talking about her life, the world above, and her dreams of adventure. She shared her stories with him like she would with a friend, her voice always gentle, always full of warmth. One morning, as she approached the alleyway where Emberling usually waited, she noticed something different. The tiny dragon wasn't curled up in the crate as he usually was. She slowed her pace, her eyes scanning the shadows, before hearing a faint, almost imperceptible rustling. "Emberling," she called softly, a smile on her face. She'd grown used to his presence, and the thought of not finding him there made her heart sink. There was another rustle, followed by a quiet, strained hiss. Elara stepped closer, her footsteps light. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw Emberling, his fragile wings slightly unfurled, trying, and failing, to hover above the ground. He was attempting to fly. A wave of pride surged through her. "You're trying?" Elara exclaimed, her voice full of wonder. Emberling's amber eyes met hers, and for a brief moment he looked embarrassed, his wings dropping back to his sides. But Elara wasn't about to let him feel bad. She crouched beside him, her eyes sparkling. "That's amazing, Emberling. You're so brave." She could see the struggle in his eyes. The wings that had been damaged long ago, the ones that had been mocked by others, now seemed to be gaining strength with each attempt. His body still trembled from the effort, but there was something in his gaze, a glimmer of determination, that hadn't been there before. "Don't worry," Elara whispered, her hand gently resting on his smooth, cool scales. "You'll get there. We'll figure it out together." Over the next few weeks, Elara devoted herself to helping Emberling. She brought him special treats that were known to help with healing. Her father had taught her about some of the rare plants that grew in the outer colonies, and she found a few that might ease his muscle fatigue. Every morning and afternoon, she would sit with him, gently massaging his wings, encouraging him, never once showing any signs of impatience or doubt. But one day, as Elara returned to the alley where she'd come to care for Emberling, she found something she hadn't expected. There were voices, angry voices, coming from the shadows. She paused, her hand instinctively gripping the edge of the crate as she peered around the corner. A group of larger creatures, dragons by their unmistakable silhouettes, stood in the alleyway, their voices low but sharp. "Why is this little thing still here?" one of them sneered, his wings folded tightly against his back. "It's pathetic. Doesn't even belong here." Another dragon, larger and with scars across its snout, spat, the sound harsh as it hit the ground. Elara's heart raced as she recognized them. They were the same dragons who had mocked Emberling, ridiculed him for his small size and his inability to fly. They had come to torment him again. Without thinking, Elara rushed forward, her footsteps echoing in the narrow space. She wasn't sure what she planned to do, but she knew she couldn't let them hurt him again. "Leave him alone," she shouted, standing between the dragons and Emberling, who had shrunk back into the corner of the crate, his wings fluttering in distress. The larger dragon that had spoken turned toward her, narrowing his eyes. "And who are you to tell us what to do, little human?" Elara stood tall, her hands clenched at her sides. "I'm his friend. And I don't care how big or small you are, you don't get to bully him." The dragons exchanged glances, clearly surprised by her defiance. Elara, however, wasn't backing down. Her eyes locked with the largest dragon's, and though she felt a flicker of fear, she didn't show it. "This is not your ally. He's not yours to torment," Elara said, her voice steady. "I'll make sure of it." The dragon sneered, clearly unimpressed. "You're just a human child," one muttered, but there was a hesitation in his voice. Before they could say more, Elara heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps, her father's guards. They had been alerted by the commotion. The dragon seemed to sense it too, and with one last defiant look at Elara, they backed off, slinking away into the shadows. Elara exhaled in relief, her heart still racing. She turned to Emberling, who had watched the whole exchange with wide, confused eyes. She knelt beside him, offering him a reassuring smile. "It's okay now," she whispered. "You're safe." Emberling blinked up at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. Though he couldn't speak, the warmth in his gaze said everything. Slowly, his tiny wings twitched, and for the first time since she had met him, Elara saw a genuine spark of joy in his expression. It was a small, fragile thing, like the first glimmer of light breaking through the clouds after a storm, but it was there. Elara knew that this moment was a turning point. Emberling was no longer the broken, lonely dragon she had found in the alley. With each passing day he was beginning to heal, not just his wings but his heart. And she, Elara, would be there every step of the way. The ember was no longer just a flicker. It was a flame, and with her help, it would burn brightly again. Chapter 3: The First Flight. As the weeks passed, Elara and Emberling grew closer, their bond strengthening like the threads of an unbreakable rope. Emberling had started to thrive in ways Elara never could have imagined. His scales, once dull and faded, now shimmered in the dim light of the alley, glistening with a faint glow they had held in his youth. His wings, though still delicate, were gaining strength, and every time he attempted to flap them, they carried him a little higher off the ground. But there was one thing still left for Emberling: flight. Though he had tried countless times, his wings still weren't strong enough to lift him fully off the ground for more than a few seconds. Each failure left him exhausted and frustrated, and on those days, Elara would sit with him, offering words of comfort and encouragement. She'd even resorted to performing little rituals she'd seen from the other species in the Nexus, talking to the stars, offering small trinkets to the winds, anything that might help Emberling believe in himself again. One evening, as the stars blinked faintly above, Elara arrived at their usual spot to find Emberling resting in the crate, his small head resting on his folded wings. She noticed immediately that his posture seemed different. Instead of the usual curled-up form of a dragon who felt small and helpless, he sat upright, his wings unfurled and almost poised. Something was different. "Emberling," she whispered, walking toward him. "What's going on?" At her voice, the little dragon raised his head. His amber eyes met hers, and for the first time, there was no trace of fear or doubt. Instead, there was a flicker of excitement, a spark that had not been there before. "I think," he seemed to say in a way only she could understand. His wings twitched and a gentle breeze stirred around them. "I think I'm ready." Elara's heart raced. She had heard of moments like this before, the moment when a dragon, especially one who had been broken, finally felt strong enough to take flight. She knelt beside him, her hands resting gently on his shoulders. "You've always been ready, Emberling," she whispered softly. "You just needed to believe it." With a deep breath, Emberling spread his wings fully, each delicate membrane stretching like a work of art before taking flight. For a moment, Elara thought she might burst from the tension. Then, with a single powerful flap, Emberling lifted off the ground. At first, he wobbled, his body tilting to one side before he quickly regained his balance. Elara held her breath as she watched him hover uncertainly, his wings beating rhythmically as if trying to find their rhythm. Then, with a burst of strength, Emberling shot upward, soaring higher than he had ever dared before. Elara jumped to her feet, her eyes wide with amazement. "You did it," she cried. "You're flying?" The little dragon darted through the air, his wings cutting through the thick atmosphere of the Nexus with grace and agility. His flight was shaky at first, but with each beat of his wings he gained confidence. He circled the alleyway, weaving through the narrow spaces between crates and rusted machinery, as if testing his limits. Elara clapped her hands, cheering. "That's it, Emberling. You're amazing." The dragon banked in a wide arc, flying higher now, his movements more fluid. For the first time since Elara had met him, Emberling was truly free. He let out a triumphant cry, one that echoed through the alleyways of the Nexus, a sound filled with triumph and joy. As Emberling flew higher, Elara watched, her heart swelling with pride. The sight was more than just a victory over the physical limitations of his wings, it was a victory over the years of torment, the endless bullying, the pain he had endured. He had finally found his strength, not just in his wings but in himself. After several loops around the alley, Emberling circled back down toward Elara, landing softly on the ground before her. His wings fluttered once, twice, as if still adjusting to the newfound freedom of flight. His amber eyes met hers, and for the first time, Elara saw something she hadn't before: peace. Elara dropped to her knees, her hands gently resting on his wings as she whispered, "You did it, Emberling. You're perfect just the way you are." The dragon let out a soft chirring sound, nuzzling her cheek with his cool snout. His wings, though still delicate, now looked strong and capable, as if they could carry him through any storm. It was then that Elara realized something deeper. Emberling's transformation wasn't just about flight, or his wings, or even his scales. It was about the growth of his spirit, the healing of his heart. He had moved beyond the cruel words of the other dragons, beyond the hopelessness that had once consumed him. As they sat together in the alley, the distant sounds of the Nexus bustling around them, Elara knew that Emberling's journey was far from over. But now she wasn't just a girl offering scraps of food or encouragement. She was the one who had given him a chance to dream again. And he, in turn, had shown her that even in the darkest places, there was light to be found. Together, they had become something stronger than either of them had imagined. A pair of unlikely friends, bound not just by kindness, but by the belief that even the smallest, most fragile spark of hope could ignite into something unstoppable. And as the stars shone brightly above them, Elara and Emberling made a silent promise. No matter what the future held, they would face it together, side by side. Emberling may have just taken his first flight, but they both knew this was only the beginning of their adventure. Chapter 4. a new threat. As the days continued to stretch into weeks, Emberling and Elara's bond grew stronger with each passing moment. The alleyways, once cold and lonely, became a sanctuary where the two of them could find peace from the chaos of the world around them. Emberling's once withered wings had gained strength, and his flight was becoming more graceful and powerful with every attempt. Elara could hardly contain her pride whenever she saw him soar through the air, his scales glimmering in the fading sunlight. But the Nexus was a vast and unpredictable place, filled with creatures who thrived on power and dominance. Not all who roamed its corridors were as kind-hearted as Elara, and not all dragons shared her love for Emberling. As Emberling's wings grew stronger and his spirit brighter, the quiet whisper of danger began to stir in the shadows. One evening, as Elara sat with Emberling brushing through his scales, a low, guttural growl reached her ears. She froze, her heart pounding. Emberling's wings stiffened at the sound, his body tensing beside her. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, the familiar warmth of their little corner of the Nexus suddenly replaced by a sharp sense of dread. Elara, Emberling's voice, though not spoken in words, was clear in her mind. Something's coming. She stood up slowly, scanning the alley with a furrowed brow. From the corner, shadows seemed to grow longer, twisting in strange shapes as if alive. Elara instinctively stepped closer to Emberling, her hand resting protectively on his back. She could feel his muscles taut beneath her fingers, and the thrum of unease in his body mirrored her own. Then a figure emerged from the darkness, tall, imposing, and radiating an air of dominance. Elara's eyes widened as she recognized the dragon before her. It was one of the dragons who had mocked Emberling in the past, the one with the scars across his snout. His name was Vorten, a massive, intimidating creature whose reputation in the Nexus was one of cruelty and power. His eyes gleamed with malice, and he was flanked by two other dragons, both equally large and fierce. Elara, Vorten's voice rumbled like distant thunder, sending a chill through Elara's bones. "We've been watching you." Elara's stomach twisted. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her attempt to sound strong. Vorten's gaze slid to Emberling, who stood beside Elara, his wings stiff and his stance defensive. "It's not what I want, little human," Vorten sneered. "It's what he wants." Elara's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" Without warning, Vorten's massive clawed foot struck the ground, sending a shockwave through the alley. Emberling staggered back, his wings flaring in alarm. Vorten chuckled darkly. "I'm talking about the little dragon who thinks he can fly," Vorten said, his voice dripping with mockery. "A dragon like him doesn't belong here. He doesn't belong anywhere." He narrowed his eyes, his gaze turning to Elara. "And you are only encouraging this pathetic display. It's time someone taught this little runt a lesson." Before Elara could react, the two dragons flanking Vorten lunged forward, their claws swiping dangerously close to Emberling. Elara shouted in alarm, but Emberling was already moving. With a burst of speed, he darted to the side, narrowly avoiding the claws of the larger dragons. His wings fluttered wildly, and Elara watched as he struggled to maintain control, his body trembling with fear and exertion. "No!" Elara cried, stepping forward to protect Emberling. But Vorten was quicker. He blocked her path, his massive form towering over her. "You're too naive, human," Vorten growled, his breath hot with the scent of smoke. "He'll never be more than a nuisance. Dragons like him, broken, weak, they're meant to be crushed, not coddled." Elara's heart raced and her mind spun. She knew she had to protect Emberling, she couldn't let him fall into the hands of these ruthless creatures. But Vorten's presence was overpowering. The other dragons were closing in on Emberling, their eyes glowing with malice. Without thinking, Elara acted on pure instinct. She stood tall, her voice shaking but steady as she met Vorten's fiery gaze. "You're wrong," she shouted. "Emberling is stronger than you'll ever understand. He's not weak and he won't be crushed. He's free, he's my friend. And I will never let you hurt him." Vorten laughed darkly. "You really think you can stop me, human?" He raised a clawed hand ready to strike, but before he could move, a sharp cry pierced the air. Emberling's wings surged with newfound strength, and he shot forward, his small body darting through the air with surprising speed. The two larger dragons were caught off guard, and Emberling's claws found their mark, knocking one of them back. His wings flapped powerfully, sending a gust of wind through the alley, pushing the other dragon off balance. Elara's heart swelled with pride as she watched Emberling defend himself. He wasn't the broken creature he once was. He was a dragon, strong, capable, and determined. Vortin's eyes narrowed in frustration as he watched the small dragon stand his ground. "This isn't over," he snarled. "You can run now, little runt, but I will make sure you regret this. All of you." With that, the three dragons turned and fled, disappearing into the shadows from where they came. Elara stood frozen, her heart still racing. Emberling landed softly beside her, his wings folding tightly against his body. "You did it," Elara whispered, her voice filled with awe and relief. "You stood up to them?" Emberling's amber eyes gleamed with pride. He nuzzled her gently, his cool snout resting against her cheek. "I will always stand with you," he seemed to say. Elara smiled, tears welling in her eyes. "You're not alone anymore, Emberling. Not ever again." And though they had faced their first real threat together, Elara knew that this was only the beginning. The Nexus was a dangerous place, filled with forces that would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. But with Emberling by her side, she felt a surge of strength she had never known before. Together they would face whatever came their way. No matter how dark the path ahead seemed, they would walk it together, side by side. The bond they shared had already turned the smallest spark into a roaring flame. And no one, not even the most fearsome dragons in the Nexus, could extinguish it. Chapter 5: The Final Stand. The days after Vortin's visit were tense. Elara and Emberling kept to the quiet corners of the Nexus, avoiding the shadowed alleyways where Vortin and his gang might lurk. Though they were safe for now, both of them knew the threat wasn't over. The Nexus was a place ruled by the strong and the powerful, and Emberling, no matter how much he had grown, was still a target. For the first time, Elara could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her. It wasn't just about finding food for Emberling anymore. It was about keeping him safe. She couldn't bear to think of him being hurt again, especially after everything they had been through together. One evening, as she sat with Emberling in their usual spot, a small nook near an abandoned transport hub, she noticed something new. Emberling's eyes were sharp, his ears twitching with every sound. He was no longer the timid creature who had once hid in shadows. He had become stronger, more alert, and yet there was something restless about him. "What's wrong?" Elara asked, her brow furrowing. Emberling turned his head, his wings flicking nervously. "I sense them," he replied quietly. "Vortin and his dragons are coming. I can feel it in the air." Elara stood, her heart sinking. "We can't just hide forever, Emberling. We have to face them. Together." For a moment, Emberling hesitated. He had never been the type to seek confrontation, especially after everything he had been through. But Elara's words struck something deep inside him, a sense of purpose that had been missing when he was alone. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore, he was fighting for Elara too. "I'm ready," he said, his voice firm. And so, with that decision made, they set out toward the heart of the Nexus. They didn't know where exactly Vortin and his dragons would strike, but they were certain the confrontation was coming. The air was thick with tension, and the further they walked, the heavier the silence became. They arrived at an open plaza, a crossroads of trade and commerce, where creatures of all sizes milled about, engaged in their own transactions. Elara and Emberling paused at the edge, scanning the crowd. But even among the many species gathered there, they could feel the eyes of Vortin's group lurking somewhere nearby. Suddenly, a low growl rumbled through the crowd, and before Elara could react, a massive shadow loomed over them. Vortin and his two dragons appeared, their eyes gleaming with malicious intent. The crowd parted as the dragons advanced, their claws scraping the metal ground. "You thought you could hide forever?" Vortin sneered, his voice booming. "This ends now." Elara stepped in front of Emberling, her voice steady but filled with determination. "No, Vortin. It ends today. You and your gang won't terrorize us anymore." Vortin's laugh was cold and cruel. "You really think you can stop me, human? You're not even a threat. And neither is this pathetic excuse for a dragon." He turned his gaze to Emberling, his eyes narrowing. "You've grown a little, but you'll never be more than a nuisance. I will break you." Emberling's wings flared at the insult, and his body tensed, ready for battle. For the first time, Elara could see it. The fire in his eyes, the same fire that had kept him going despite everything he had suffered. "I will not let you hurt her," Emberling growled, his voice low but fierce. The battle began suddenly, without warning. Vortin lunged forward, his claws aimed at Emberling. But the little dragon was quicker, darting out of the way with surprising agility. His wings beat strongly as he soared high into the air, his claws extended to strike. Vortin's two lackeys tried to intercept him, but Emberling was too fast. He swooped low, knocking one of them off balance, sending the dragon crashing into a pile of crates. The other dragon roared and launched itself toward Emberling, but he was already out of reach, darting to the side just out of its grasp. Elara watched with wide eyes, amazed at the strength Emberling had developed. He was no longer the timid creature who had hidden in shadows. He was a force to be reckoned with. But Vortin was still a threat. The massive dragon growled in fury, his eyes blazing as he turned toward Elara. "You want to fight me, human? Let's see how long you last." He lunged at her with terrifying speed. Without thinking, Elara grabbed a long rod lying on the ground nearby and swung it at Vortin's face. The impact barely fazed him, but it did give Emberling the moment he needed. With a roar of fury, the little dragon dove toward Vortin, his claws outstretched. Vortin stumbled back in surprise, barely managing to block the strike, but Emberling's attack had bought Elara enough time. She scrambled to safety as Emberling engaged Vortin in a fierce struggle. The two dragons clashed with a power that shook the ground beneath them, their scales scraping together with an earth-shattering noise. But Emberling wasn't alone. Elara, though terrified, did not hesitate. She picked up a few more tools, throwing them toward the other two dragons, distracting them just enough so that Emberling could keep up his assault. Vortin, now visibly struggling against Emberling's newfound strength, let out a roar of frustration. "You may have strength, little dragon, but you lack the experience." With that, he made one last desperate move. He swung his tail around with terrifying force, sending Emberling sprawling into a stack of crates. For a moment, Elara thought Emberling was finished. But then Emberling rose, his body bruised but not broken. His wings unfurled, trembling with determination. He let out a mighty roar, one that echoed through the plaza. "I will not give up." With a final, powerful strike, Emberling launched himself at Vortin. This time the blow hit true. Vortin let out a pained cry, staggering back before collapsing to the ground, defeated. The remaining dragons, seeing their leader fall, turned and fled into the shadows, retreating in fear of the power that had just been unleashed. Elara ran to Emberling's side, her hands trembling as she checked him for injuries. "You did it," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "You stopped them." Emberling, exhausted but triumphant, nuzzled her gently, his wings folding around her protectively. "We did it," he replied softly. For the first time, Elara allowed herself to breathe. The battle had been won, but more importantly, Emberling had proven something that would stay with them both forever. No matter the odds, he was no longer broken. He was strong and he was not alone. As they stood together in the quiet aftermath, the Nexus stretching endlessly around them, Elara knew their adventure was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, more battles to face, but with Emberling by her side, she felt invincible. And so, the girl and the dragon walked into the future, ready for whatever came their way together.